Welcome to the screencast on Playform validation. And the idea here is that whenever we are asking the user to provide input, we want to be able to make sure that input is not garbage. Okay, so let's say we have this mock-up application. We have these three fields: first name, last name, phone number. And what we'd like to be true is that the user enters something for the first name, enters something for the last name, enters something for the telephone field, and then just add a little spice. Telephone field has to contain 12 characters that would roughly conform to the area code and then the 7-digit telephone number. Obviously, you'd want to do a lot more in the real case, but this will give you enough basically to do whatever you want. You can make the validation code as complicated as you'd like it. So what we'd like basically is if we click the add button and we haven't entered anything, that we're now highlight all of the fields in red and provide some help text about what went wrong. If we then entered something into the first field and press the add button, that field would now look good, but the two other fields would look bad. Fixing the last field would be good. And then if we entered a telephone number that didn't conform to the format that we wanted, we'd actually get a different message. So there's two kinds of validation messages that can be displayed for the phone field. First, that it should be non-empty, and then the second thing is that it should be 12 digits long. And then finally, if you add in a regular phone number, everything looks good. Okay, so I'm sorry, that was left in there. So how do we do this validation in Play? And it turns out that it's actually not really difficult to do. The first thing we have to understand is how do you use the Twitter Bootstrap 3 CSS classes to do validation. And it turns out there's only two classes you really need to know about. One is this hasError class for indicating that control state so you can turn things red. And the second thing is a help block class, which enables you to provide nicely formatted text messages as part of your form controls. Second thing we need to do is provide an actual method which is going to go through all those field values and make sure that they're valid and indicate errors when we notice them. The third part is to add in validation code into the view, so of course things happen appropriately. And then finally we're going to actually invoke the validation method when we're in the controller and do the right thing. So let's briefly go through how all these things work. If you go through the Twitter Bootstrap documentation on forms, you'll find this section on validation states, and it basically says that if you want to indicate that an input has an error, you add this hasError class to the form group. Okay, we could have turned our forms green when they were success. I just didn't add that in, but certainly that's possible with Twitter Bootstrap. And we could have made it yellow, the telephone field, if it had data but wasn't quite right. You could have done anything. So, but in this case, we're just going to have the default, gray value or red if there's a problem. The second thing we need to know about Twitter Bootstrap is there's this thing called a help block, which is basically a span where the class is help block, and then you put anything in there, and it will be displayed. The nice thing about it is that the color of this we don't have to worry about, because by indicating hasError in our validation state, it's going to automatically color this text the way we want it to be. Okay, so that's all we really need to know about Twitter Bootstrap. I recommend you go to the documentation, look at it a little bit, or not really, because basically I've shown you all you need to know. Second thing we need to do is take that contact form data backing class for the form that used to be very, very simple and just contain those three public accessors. And we're going to add a method called validate to it, which is going to return a list. Well, it's going to return either null if we couldn't find any errors, or it's going to return a list of these validation error objects in the case that we found a validation problem. And you can see that the structure of this is super simple. We create a this errors object, which is a list of validation error, and then we start going through the fields in our backing class, like the first name field, and we check to see what's in there. And so in this case, we check to see if it's null, or we check to see whether it's the empty string. And if it's either of those two things, then what we do is we add a new object to the errors, this errors thing, errors list of validation errors, which is a new validation error, and it just takes two things. One is the name of the field, okay, that has the error, and the second thing is the strings indicating what the heck you want to say about that error. Okay, and you can go through this, and the thing that's actually kind of cool is that you can add, we can do two different checks for the telephone field. Okay, and we can add, even more than one validation error if we wanted to for a given field. Okay, and so I showed an example of just a little bit more complicated one where I checked to see the telephone length is not identically equal to the value 12, which is listed up here in the private static final int. So we get rid of that magic number check style error, and if so, we provide this error. So there's two kinds of things we're checking for with telephones. And then what we're going to return is we use this ternary expression in Java to avoid an if then else, which I think is kind of cleaner in this particular situation. We're going to return if errors.is empty. Okay, we'll return null. So if there's nothing in the errors object, we return null. Otherwise, return that errors object. Okay, so that's our process for validation. You can make this field as method as complicated as you want. In the play documentation, what you're going to normally find is that they're going to try to add validation annotations to the fields in the model class, and that's cool. I mean, no doubt about it, that's a cool way to go. I guess the thing that I've found is that it gets kind of gnarly to figure out, how to do certain kind of validations using those annotations. And then secondly, you've now got some annotations that have to do with your back-end database persistence, and other annotations that have to do with the validation of the form, and other validations that might have to do with, there's some validation occurring with the back-end database, some validation occurring with the form. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're different. I personally have found that my life is a little better if I just have this backing form class. I do the validation of the form here. It's really obvious, and then over in my model, when I get there, I can add annotations that are purely concerned with the database issues, and things are a little more straightforward. It's not as declarative. There's going to be more reuse of code. I'm really not going to claim this as any kind of golden answer to the problems. I mean, I definitely think there's trade-offs. So this particular method has its own strengths, has its own weaknesses. I think from a learning perspective, when you're getting started, if you go this direction, you're gonna be able to debug things easier. That's the main thing. It's pretty easy to figure out where you're doing validation and what the validation is, and when it doesn't work, you know where to go to fix it, and you have a lot more control. And there's a little bit more typing involved, and it's a little less declarative, but I don't know. I think you'll be happy with this approach. Okay, so the next thing we have to do is implement the validation in the view, and there's a lot of repeated code here. So I'm just isolating one of our forms groups, which is the form group for the last name. I picked that at random. So there's first name, last name, telephone. They all have exactly the same structure. I'm just going to show you one of them here. So there's two pieces that we're going to actually be fiddling with. The first is we're going to add, remember in Twitter Bootstrap, it wants to attach has error. If we go back to Twitter Bootstrap, okay, it wants to have form group has error if you want to have input with error. So you want to get this red thing. So what we're going to do in our view is we're going to have in our form group, so we have a class, quote, form group, and then we start this Scala expression right here, okay? And the Scala expression says, hey, if in our contact form, if the last name field has errors, then output the string has error right here. Otherwise, if it doesn't have errors, don't do anything. So basically what's going to happen is when there's no errors, it's just going to say div class equals form group in the string form group. But when there are errors, it's going to say div class equals, quote, form group space has error, quote. Okay, that's all that does. It's just a simple if statement with no else clause, just a then clause. Okay, so that's how we're going to highlight. We're going to make our whole form control into red in the case that there's an error. And then down here, what we wanted, remember we wanted some help text when there's an error, and that help text was generated in our validation method. It was these fields right here. First name is required, last name is required, telephone is required. So how do we get that to appear in our form? Okay, well this is a little bit of Scala / play black magic. At this point, I'm gonna say you don't really have to understand this. And I hate saying that because my whole point of doing this approach is to try to minimize the amount of like black magic, wave a dead cat kind of coding. But I can't avoid it. In this case, the way to do this, which is super clean and easy to do, involves not understanding, it very well. What you're going to do is you're going to create this span class help block, which is what the Twitter Bootstrap folks want. Right there it is right there. And then to get the text to go in it, we're going to have a Scala expression. And in this case, we'll have because it's going to actually be a function call, I guess. No, there's a block in there. So we're going to have a curly brace rather than just a simple parentheses. We're going to take our contact form, find the last name field, and then we're going to get out the error of the error field, and then there might be multiple errors associated with this particular field. So we're going to invoke a mapping function which is going to map individual errors into this error message string, which is then going to be the resulting value of this help block. Okay, so a little funky, but it works, and really all you need to do is just cut and paste this entire line of code and then just edit that string to be the field that you're worried about. And if all goes according to plan, everything will be great. Okay, that's how that works, kind of. The fourth part is to check for validation in the controller. Okay, so this is a little interesting here. What we're going to do is, in our post method, which is going to process the user inputting form values via the post HTTP operation. First thing we're going to do is we're going to do this bind from request to get this form data object, which is of type form of contact form data. Okay. Then what we're going to do is we're going to say, does that form data have errors? And we're just going to call that has errors, and that somehow magically inside looks to invokes that validation method. So when we say this has errors, it's going to invoke that validate method and figure out whether it returned null or not. If it didn't return null, then it's got this list of validation objects that say, okay, you have errors. And so we're going to execute this block. Now, just for debugging, kind of so you can see what's going on purposes, I put the system.out.println in there. You don't have that in production. You just, but it might help you to kind of follow along in the console with what's happening. Then what you do is you return, and instead of returning OK, which is the only thing we've ever returned up till now, you finally want to return a different kind of status. Because it's not okay, right? You found an error. So the status that you generally want to return in this case is called bad request, which I forget the number that's for bad request, but you can look it up pretty easily. And what we're going to do is we're going to return the new contact page just like we always do. We're going to render it, and we're just going to render it with the form data. And because of the fact that this form data has had this validation processing done on it, when we re-render that page, what we're going to find is this Scala expression will now determine that there are errors in that form data, and so this has error is going to be produced in the code in the HTML. Also, when we invoke this error map, error to error message, we're going to get that error message coming out. Okay, so that's how we're going to see the result of our errors. That's the communication, right? So once we call this bind from request, once we call this has errors to run the validation. Well, actually, I think the bind from request is where the validation is actually invoked, but this is where we check to see, for ourselves if we should do something different. Okay. In the case that the bind from request does not create any errors, then we do the else clause, and now we can call get on our form data and create this contact form data object just like we always did, and we merrily go along our way. One big caveat or thing to note about this, warning, danger Will Robinson, is that you cannot call formData.get when you have a validation method that was called and found errors. Okay, so this is going to lead to a runtime exception if it's invoked when there are errors. That's why you have to have this if then else. You check for you call bind from request, that's going to run your validation, and so then you check for any errors, and you basically do the return within this block. Okay, and then if there are no errors, then you can come down here and actually call formData.get and then move along with validation. Okay, so those are the 4 steps for doing validation. You might want to watch this a couple times or think about it, or just go on to the WAD, do your best, try not to DNF, and continue on.